I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Susan Sawatsky. Susan is fatigue risk management consultant and is the director of Scope Solutions, which is an international consulting company specializing in fatigue and stress management in the workplace. She has a vast experience in a broad range of high-risk, critical impact industries, including oil and gas, energy transmissions, and mining. Susan is also an instructor with the University of Alberta, the University of Brunswick, and the University of Calgary. Susan's recent industry experience involves drafting proposed preventional occupational health and safety fatigue legislation and creating fatigue policy guidelines for the Canadian oil and gas industry. With that, please join us in welcoming Susan Sawatsky.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Terry. I want to start by sharing that I am really excited to be here this morning talking about a topic that I am quite passionate about, and that is fatigue management in the workplace. So I want to start off by having everybody think about the last time that you were really tired. So take a minute, think about that, and then ask yourself why. So what caused you to be feeling so exhausted at that moment? Was it work-related? Was there something going on in your personal life? Or was it a combination of the two? Sorry, I just got a frog there. When we think about fatigue in the workplace, it's slightly different than some of the other hazards that we deal with. If you think about confined space, fall protection, critical lifts that we were discussing earlier, all of those are hazards that are completely encased within our work environment. But when we think about fatigue, it's a little bit unique. It can be caused by work-related factors. You could be up late working on a grant proposal, or maybe you're working long hours because you've got that deadline that's written in stone. But it can also be caused by work factors, by personal factors. For example, maybe we've got commitments to our kids or things going on around the house. Maybe we're just stressed out and not able to get enough sleep. So when we think about that two-level of risk causation, we have to remember that we need a twofold mitigation strategy in our workplaces. What you're looking at is the eye of fatigue model. And what this model shows is that we need to have those all-encompassing organizational structures, those that balance operational requirements with what we know are the biological needs of human capital. But we also need to have those workplace engagement. We need to have the education, the awareness, and the overall culture that allows people to feel empowered to manage their fatigue in relation to their work requirements. And only when we have both of those structures in place are we then able to have a true and comprehensive fatigue safety culture. So let's take a look at these factors in relation to NASA. Maybe. There we go. In preparing to come here today, I was very fortunate. I had the opportunity to speak to a number of people throughout the safety organization. And through those conversations, I was able to understand a little bit better some of the factors that existed at some of the centers in relation to fatigue. And I was also able to understand some of the mitigation strategies that are already in place. I was also able to gain a much deeper understanding of the overall safety culture that exists. I know that at NASA you have a very robust safety culture and that it's very ingrained in your overall values. And I know that one of the foundational elements involved in creating that very deep and very integrated safety culture are the 5 safety culture factors. I'm just going to pause and grab a sip of water here. These safety culture factors, I know, are as embedded in the organization as your DNA. And I know that everyone is very aware of these factors. But what I found most fascinating about these factors is that they're based on the theories of James Reason. And James Reason is an integrated theorist when we look at the development of fatigue risk management systems. And it was a perfect way to be able to share forward the understandings with regards to fatigue and fatigue management. So we'll take a look at the first trait, so to speak, and that is reporting. And when it comes to reporting, we're really talking about how our understandings of risks in the workplace translate and how to recognize those risks and stop them from becoming incidents. And when we look at fatigue, it's not always intuitive, in that often we aren't able to fully recognize fatigue as a causal factor unless we trigger a full-scale investigation and unless we're asking the right questions. So we can start off by looking historically at incidents that we know were related to fatigue. We'll start with the Exxon Valdez. So this was an incident that had no loss of life, but had very significant environmental damage. And the follow-up report noted that the crewman piloting the ship had fallen asleep at the controls after working around 18 hours straight before the accident. We can look at BP's Deepwater Horizon, the Gulf oil disaster. The original investigation done by BP did not note any fatigue-related factors, but follow-up, more intricate investigations noted that BP's investigation ignored factors such as fatigue, long shifts, and the company's poor safety culture. This incident resulted in the loss of 11 lives. We can look at the Texas City refinery incident. This incident, 15 lives were lost and 180 were injured. It was a very significant incident in which evidence showed that it was the operator's fatigue that degraded their judgment and problem-solving skills. And it was believed this is what hindered their ability to recognize the issue at hand. This incident was significant because it eventually spurred the American Petroleum Institute to develop Recommended Practice 755, which was a standard that was created for petrochemical and refining industries. And we could look at a more recent incident that happened at Metro North. This one was very obviously fatigue-related because we know the train engineer fell asleep at the controls and caused a derailment. 4 people were killed, over 60 were injured. And NASA has not been immune to the results of fatigue and fatigue-related incidents. We can look back to the Challenger and know that the Rogers Commission found that certain key managers had obtained less than 2 hours sleep the night before and had been on duty since 1 a.m. And their conclusions, some of the conclusions that were drawn, that the willingness of NASA employees in general to work excessive hours, while admirable, does create some serious questions when it jeopardizes job performance, particularly when we're talking about those key decisions. And I want to say thank you to Linda Glusing for supplying me with this slide that talks about a past incident in which STS-61 launch countdown was compromised. The operator didn't recognize a very necessary manual override, and the issue was not discovered until after the launch had been scrubbed. The operator had been on the console for 11 hours on the 3rd day, working 12-hour night shift. More than those catastrophic incidents, we can note that fatigue has an impact on safety on a daily basis. Fatigue is considered a causal factor in about 20% of all vehicle fatalities. And that's pretty significant when you compare it to the fact that alcohol is only 29%. We spend a lot of time and energy making sure that people are aware of the dangers of being impaired by alcohol while driving. But we don't talk very much about the dangers of fatigue. National Transportation Safety Board has long since recognized the issue of fatigue and safety when it comes to commercial transportation. And it's been on their top 10 safety most wanted list since the list was invented. And before we move forward, I just want to share with you a very personal story that relates to fatigue management and safety. These are really good friends of ours. It's Aaron and Katie and their little baby Luke. And about 4 months ago, Aaron was driving to work, and he has a pretty extensive commute. He drives about an hour each way. And about 5 minutes before he got to his office, a vehicle coming in the oncoming lane suddenly veered over, and there was a head-on collision. Now, both drivers survived. Both drivers are still recovering. but the other driver had just gotten off work. He'd been working an extended rotation of 12-hour night shifts, and he fell asleep at the wheel. And it was a very personal example to me of how fatigue can impact safety. When we think about how fatigue impacts us in a workplace, we really need to recognize how fatigue works in terms of impairment. And we can start with what is probably the best known study ever in terms of managing fatigue and recognizing its impairment. What these researchers did way back in the 1990s is they brought 40 people into the lab. And at first, they gave them measured amounts of alcohol, tested their blood alcohol level. And then after everybody had had a chance to sober up, they brought them back into the lab and they just kept them awake for 28 hours straight. And both times they gave them a task that tested their mental, physical performance abilities, and they just compared the results. And what they found was after only 17 hours awake, we perform at the same level of impairment as someone with a blood alcohol level of 0.05. At around 21 hours awake, we are as impaired in our ability to do a task as someone at the legal limit with a blood alcohol level of 0.08. And at about 24 hours awake, we are as impaired in our abilities as someone well over the legal limit with a blood alcohol of 0.10. And again, we can think about this impairment in the workplace and recognize that we would never dream of letting someone who was legally intoxicated show up at work. We wouldn't let them in the door, let alone have them operate machinery or drive. But we don't always have that same recognition when someone shows up and says, I'm exhausted. When we think about fatigue, fatigue really tends to impact us in waves. So the first wave, when we start to become tired, it impacts our ability to pay attention to what's going on around us. We miss some of those clues, we're not focused. From there, it starts to impact our emotional abilities. So we're less stable, we're less capable to deal with things that are going on around us. We tend to be more impulsive and we tend to take more risks. I think Vegas might have been based on that understanding that we take more risks when we're tired. If we don't manage it at that stage, it moves into our mental abilities. And we have trouble remembering, we have trouble thinking clearly, some of our judgment and problem-solving abilities are impacted. And finally, if we don't manage our fatigue at that stage, it begins to impact our physical abilities. So we'll notice a reduction in terms of fine and gross motor coordination, reduction in reaction time. And the worst of the worst, where fatigue is now most often recognized in terms of causing an incident, is when it causes something that's called a microsleep. So that's that 2 to 60 second sort of, chicken head nap, where we don't have control and we don't recognize that it's coming. And it really comes down to the fact that we know that sleep is a basic biological need. But you never hear about anybody who dies from lack of sleep, and that's because our bodies have the ability to take over and make us sleep when we need it. The problem is, of course, that the part of our brain that says, I need sleep and I need it now, doesn't talk to the part of our brain that says, driving a vehicle, maybe not a good time for a nap. All of the impairment combined really brings out the fact that a sleep-deprived employee is 3 times more likely to contribute to a workplace accident than one that is well rested. When we think about it in terms of incident investigations, we can recognize that impairment occurring in various ways. Workplace signs to be aware of are things like people not paying attention, zoning out, that tendency for risk-taking, having trouble focusing. Our visual perception is very much impacted by our fatigue. People will do things like double check or just not quite remembering, as well as that struggle to make decisions and even that clumsiness when we're starting to get into the physical, tripping, dropping things. All of those signs can trigger different levels of incidents that will, again, trigger different levels of reporting. And what it comes down to is that fatigue causes 2 types of incidents. In a high-risk environment, it will often cause the high frequency, low severity incidents. Those incidents that happen often, that happen frequently, but that don't really have those significant consequences. Those that would trigger type 1 in terms of reporting. Often these are never recognized as fatigue related. If someone forgets a procedure or something like that, we don't typically put it down to fatigue. But it can also trigger those low frequency, high severity incidents, those incidents that are a lot more severe. And depending on the type of follow-up investigation that occurs, those may or may not be recognized as fatigue. When it comes to recognizing fatigue in terms of incident investigations, it really comes down to asking the right questions that will either identify or rule out if it was a contributing causal factor. And my understanding from some of the conversations I've been having is that NASA right now is looking at the HFACS, Incident Investigation System, that will help identify some of those human factors, including fatigue. Overall, when we comb the research and we look at fatigue in terms of its impacts on safety, we can recognize that fatigue does impact safety. Research has shown that working more than 50 hours a week almost doubles the risk of having an incident. And working more than 64 can create up to an 88% increase in risk. There's that association between sleep and poor performance actually goes up when we're over the age of 30. In relation to all things, we become a little more susceptible. Some tasks are much more related to fatigue degradation than others. For example, memory lapses are likely to increase up 2.4 times in studies, and perceptual increases 3.2 times. Fatigue is consistently noted as one of the top 5 causes when we look at worker error, and we know that worker error can definitely contribute to workplace incidents. And fatigue is 4 times more likely to contribute to workplace incidents than drugs or alcohol. For the most part, we're very aware of and manage drugs and alcohol. Now, we can also think about fatigue in looking at the other side of health and safety, and that is looking at the health components. When we think about contributors to our overall health and wellness, we know that there are really 3 key pillars in terms of factors that we can control that will help in terms of our overall health and wellness. The first, nutrition. And we know a lot about nutrition. Most people are very aware of the types of food you should eat. We know calories, we know quantities. We're pretty aware of that. And our second key pillar is exercise. And again, we have a lot of awareness when it comes to exercise. Most people can tell you their exercise regime. They know all kinds of exercise programs that exist. But our third key pillar in terms of factors that we can control that will influence our overall health and wellness is sleep. And people don't often recognize this one, and we certainly don't have the types of information available when it comes to understanding sleep. We can look at some of the health impacts when we don't get enough. So we know that regular sleep deprivation increases cardiovascular disease by up to 40%. And we know that irregular sleep causes irregular blood sugar levels, particularly if you're sleeping outside of regular daytime-nighttime hours. And those irregular blood sugar levels can lead to an increase in type 2 diabetes. Fatigue will impact things like mental health. Workers who are regularly sleep deprived have an increase in things like depression and anxiety. And I like this one. What do you think? True or false? Fatigue makes you fat. Well, it definitely contributes, and there's been a lot of research lately that supports this. What it comes down to is recognizing that we need sleep to be able to control a lot of the hormones that regulate our appetite. And if we don't get enough sleep, we tend to be extra hungry the next day. And not only are you extra hungry, you actually want larger portions and you crave higher calorie foods. And it's really thought that this is because our body is not getting the energy that it needed from sleep. So it's trying to make up that lack of energy from something, and it will do that through food. We can look at a number of health impacts that come from not getting sleep on a regular basis. 15% increased risk in stroke, increased risk in multiple types of cancers, including some common cancers like breast cancer, colon cancer. We know that fatigue will increase your likelihood of hypertension or high blood pressure, as well as increasing things like your libido and your fertility. We know that those who are regularly sleep deprived have memory, concentration issues. They have sort of that brain fog that's going on. It will increase things like musculoskeletal injuries, and it has a big impact on our gastrointestinal tract, which means increase in certain things like peptic ulcers. As well, being tired will increase our overall immunity, so you're more likely to get those colds and flus that come around on a regular basis. Overall, a sleep-deprived individual has statistically a 12% increased risk of death. Okay, so we've taken a look at some of the factors that relate to fatigue in terms of safety, and we've taken a look at it in terms of health. I know that one of the key factors here is that you are a learning organization. And very much, I know from many of my conversations with Mike, you very much are a learning organization. It is the reason that we're here today. When we think about it in terms of fatigue, learning really comes down to understanding some of the background, some of the physiological influences that relate to fatigue. And these understandings help in terms of understanding it as a risk, but also in terms of understanding how to manage it. So I call this section Fatigue Science 101. And it starts off by understanding one of the amazing things that our brain does when we sleep. And this is really interesting stuff. This is research that's really only come out in the last couple of years. And what researchers have been able to show is what is believed to be the main reason that we and almost every other creature on Earth need sleep. And what they recognized is that when we go into our deeper stages of sleep, our brains, the blood vessels shrink ever so slightly, and they flood with something called cerebral spinal fluid. And that cerebral spinal fluid is believed to be what clears out a lot of the toxins within our brains and replenishes our brain cells at the cellular level. It's the reason that we can look at a scan and see the difference between a well-rested brain and one that is very sleep-deprived. Another interesting bit of background information that's useful when we want to understand sleep better is knowing about sleep cycles. So our understanding of sleep cycles came about way back in the 1960s when scientists took those electroencephalographs up to people's brains and just measured the brain waves that we naturally give off. And they used that to develop a better understanding of what it is we do when we sleep. And when we're asleep, we go through 4 stages of sleep. Now, stage 1 and 2, if you wake up from a stage 1 or 2 sleep, you're going to be wide awake, you're going to be alert pretty easily, and you might not even be sure you've been asleep. Stage 1 and 2 are those light stages of sleep that help to restore us in terms of our alertness and in terms of our mental abilities. From there, we move into the deeper sleep, that's stage 3 sleep. If you get woken up from a stage 3 sleep, you're going to have that sleep inertia, that difficulty waking up, getting going again. Those deep stages of sleep are when it's now believed that our brains are flooding with those cerebral spinal fluids and clearing out the toxins. And finally, our 4th stage of sleep, one most people have heard of, and that's the REM, the rapid eye movement, or the dream sleep. And dream sleep, of course, is when we're processing a lot of the learning that occurs through the day and making long-term memories. Now, we go through those 4 stages of sleep in a sleep cycle, and that sleep cycle takes between 60 and 90 minutes. The takeaway from this, the reason this is important, is it helps us to recognize that it's not just the quantity of sleep that we're getting that's important in terms of restoring us, but also the quality is very critical. And the third thing that's important to understand when we think about managing fatigue is circadian rhythms. So I'm guessing most people here have heard of circadian rhythms. And circadian rhythms are really any of our body systems that function on those 24-hour cycles. And a lot of our body systems do that, from our heart rate, our blood pressure, a number of the hormones that we produce, they all function on that 24-hour system. And that 24-hour system is regulated by the light cues that we receive from our environment. And what you're looking at is a pretty typical circadian rhythm. If you're a morning person, you're going to be a little more to the early side. If you're a night owl, you're going to be a little more to the late side. But basically, this is a typical person's circadian rhythm. And what it shows us is that biologically, around 7 o'clock in the morning until around 10 o'clock at night, our body systems are all functioning to have us be alert and awake and prepared and reacting to our environment. You notice that little dip that occurs between 1 to 3 in the afternoon. Anybody notice the little dip that occurs between 1 to 3 in the afternoon, right? Yeah, we all start to feel a little bit tired. We call it the post-lunch dip. But aside from that, daytime is when our biology is telling us we need to be alert and we need to be awake. Sometime around 11 o'clock until around 6 o'clock in the morning, all of that changes. And our biology is trying to have us be less aware of our environment and less focused and less aware of what's going on. Now, how our circadians impact us in terms of safety is, of course, shift work. So if we're trying to have people do work at 2 o'clock in the morning, we know that biologically their blood pressure might be a little bit lower and their heart rate might be a little bit lower. And if they try and eat food, their digestive enzymes aren't going to be as capable of reacting to that. And they're actually going to have neurochemicals that are going to slow down how fast those neurotransmitters are able to transmit information. Now, it's not to say we can't do work at 2 o'clock in the morning. We know that we can. But it's recognizing that we are somewhat impaired in our overall abilities, and we won't be performing at our top level in the same way that we would be during the day. The other way that circadians impact us is through jet lag. So, anybody here travel from a time zone or more away? A few people? Yeah, absolutely. And so circadians basically are when we are moving our light cues faster than we're able to move our internal rhythms. And we feel that in terms of jet lag. And seasonal affective disorder. Now, I know that here in Houston, the difference in daytime hours during the summer versus daytime hours during the winter is not that big. It's only about 4 hours start to finish. But for those of us that have real winters, for those of us that live a little further north, this can definitely be an issue. And really what's happening is our circadians are going into drift. So sometime around November until around February, they're not getting those hard light cues first thing in the morning because our daytime hours in the winter are shorter. And it affects things in terms of our energy level. Some people get insomnia, and a lot of people are affected in terms of their emotions. So depression tends to be higher. All right, so that's some of the background information.
Do you have a question on work shifts?
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any insight on the impact of changing work cycles on fatigue? So the way it's being described is working a day shift and then 8 hours later having to show up to cover a console operation. So not just the length of awakeness, but also the effect of changing shifts.
Yeah, so when it comes to shift changes, there's a lot of science behind what are the optimal shifts and trying to recognize how to do those changeovers. In that particular situation, what you have is someone who was already shortchanged in shifts if they were working the night shift, for example. We know that daytime sleep tends to be shorter. Again, you're fighting that biology. So daytime sleep for shift workers tends to be around 5 to 6 hours. I think I might be having some feedback there. 5 to 6 hours in total, rather than the 7 to 8 hours that most of us are able to get in the night. So they're already shortchanged in sleep. They're already in their higher levels of fatigue. And if they're coming back, absolutely, that's having an impact on their fatigue. So when we come to the organizational strategies at the end, those are definitely the things to be looking at in terms of monitoring people's ability to be on call or work overtime, particularly when they're already at higher risk with regards to fatigue and the shifts they're working. Yeah, thank you. All right, moving into the next trait or the next safety culture factor, and that is flexible. And being flexible really comes down to being able to take those learnings and being able to take the understandings in terms of health and safety and apply it to what exists and shift what needs shifting. So I want to start off the conversation of flexible by asking a question. And I want to ask you, what's your number? So, not asking for phone numbers. What I want to know is, what is your sleep number? So, I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation here. Who here gets less than 5 hours sleep on a regular basis? Okay. Who here gets between 5 and 6 hours sleep? Okay. Between 6 and 7? And 7, 8, 9. All right. Well, to the 7, 8, 9 group, congratulations. It's tough to do. But for the rest of us, let's take a look at what that means. Because we know that there is differences physiologically that, we do vary as individuals. We're not all the same. Most of us need around 7 to 8 hours sleep, but there's a very small percentage that only needs, 4 or 5. So the question is, are you one of that very slim genetic percentage that needs way less sleep, or have you just learned to cope and function on less sleep? Well, we know that we can learn to cope and function on less sleep. Not only do we know it from experience, but also this is a study that was done at a very remote work camp. And what they did is they had measuring devices, an actigraph, that measured the actual sleep that people were obtaining, and they knew they weren't getting enough sleep. And they also asked them their perception, and they rated their perception of impairment by fatigue. And what they found is for the first 4 days, when they asked them, do you feel you're impaired by fatigue? They would say yes and rate it. And it equated pretty well to the level of impairment that they were seeing when they tested them out. But sometime around day 4, being exhausted just became the new normal. And so when they started asking them, are you impaired by fatigue? They'd go, no, I'm good. I'm used to it. I can function on 5 hours sleep. No worries. But when they tested them out, they did find an ever-declining level of impairment. So the question is, are you one of the few, or have you just learned to function on less sleep? And we'll take a little test together and try and determine that. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions, and these answers to these questions are really going to help you determine if you're operating at a sleep debt or if you're getting enough. So first question. Do you need an alarm clock to wake up in the morning? Do you set it just for insurance, or is that what wakes you up every morning? So who needs the alarm clock? Okay. Question number 2. Does it take you a while to get out of bed? Do you tell yourself that eternal lie of, 5 more minutes. I will be so much more awake in just 5 more minutes. Who here has snooze button as their best friend every morning? All right. Question number 3, do you need lots of stimulants to get through the day? Is that cup of coffee absolutely essential for you to be able to function? Who here lives for that morning cup of coffee? All right. We're getting into the big questions now. Do you sleep longer on your day off? Who does it? Who sleeps extra on the day off? Yeah. Absolutely classic sleep debt recovery. When do we pay it back? When we've got the weekend coming up. And here we go. Biggest question of all. You ready for it? Do you almost always fall asleep whenever you are in a warm, comfortable place? Are you the person who cannot tell me the end of any movie that you have tried to watch in the past year because you never make it that far? Who does it? Who falls asleep in the warm, comfortable place? All right, I see hands going up, but yeah, it's me. If you're answering yes to one or more of those questions, and particularly if you're answering yes to questions 4 and 5, chances are very good that you have a sleep debt. And we'll look at some strategies for managing that as we go in. And you're not alone. When we look at statistics, we know that about 40% of Americans are not getting enough sleep on a regular basis. 30% of adults get less than 6 hours of sleep. And about 2/3, around 63%, of Americans say that they're not getting enough sleep during the week. So we know this is pretty common. But leadership sets the example. So on a regular basis, if you are always pushing and pushing and pushing, what kind of example is that setting in terms of a culture of fatigue management? The other thing to think about in terms of managing fatigue is the barriers that exist. And there are a lot of barriers. When we talk about, fall protection, everybody's on side and they recognize, oh, of course, that's a hazard and of course we have to manage it. But when we talk about fatigue, sometimes people aren't really sure. And part of that comes from the fact that lack of sleep is common. We run on this 24-hour society. We go, 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 go. We don't value sleep, and it's really common for people to be tired. What's more, we've got a little bit of that Superman syndrome. We admire people who push past those insignificant little things like sleep to be able to get the job done. A lot of people aren't aware. We view fatigue and being tired as a weakness or an inconvenience. We don't really see it in terms of impacting us in our health and impacting us in our safety, and we don't see it as one of our 3 key pillars of overall health and wellness. And outside of certain industries, there's really not a lot of education and awareness in the workplace with regards to fatigue, even in some very high-risk industries. And here at NASA, some of the barriers that exist, you are a culture of high performance and excellence. And that's a fantastic thing. But recognizing that that needs to be done in a way that is sustainable. And the biggest barrier to managing fatigue, perceptions. How many of you guys drive by this guy on a construction site and go, wow, that's awesome. Look at him managing his risk of fatigue. That is not our first impression. What do we think? Lazy, sloughing off. Oh my gosh, look at that guy. He should be fired on the spot. And yet, we'd have no issue giving this guy 15 minutes to go have a smoke break. Well, fair enough, fair enough. All right. Our next factor in terms of overall safety culture factors is just. And really, this comes down to creating across the agency that ability to manage fatigue. And it brings us back to the eye of fatigue model. So when we start and we look at those organizational structures, what we're looking at again are the operational requirements. Absolutely, we look at scheduling. And we recognize things like shifts and how important it is in terms of shifts, in terms of on-call, that we are recognizing the level of risk we're placing people at when we have those hours that require people to work past fatigue. But we need to look at more than just scheduling. We can look at things like work tasks. So the tasks that we're doing, we can intuitively recognize that if they're physically and mentally demanding, they're going to increase our risk of overall fatigue. But it's actually those tasks that are really boring, really monotonous. Those are the tasks that tend to bring on those feelings of fatigue. When we look at things in our work environment, again, we can recognize temperature extremes, vibration, noise, chaos, all of those things increase our risks of becoming fatigued. But often, in the case of fatigue, it's the change of environment. So it's when you go from being active and working outside into that nice, comfortable vehicle of the cab of the truck or the cab of the car, that's when it starts to hit home. Other factors, we can remember things in terms of demographics. Older people are more influenced by fatigue, and especially when we look at shift work, the over 40 crowd is much more likely to be impacted by that. And other factors include things like living in those winter zones or travel. When it comes to knowing the countermeasures, knowing the strategies within an organization to use to measure fatigue, you guys are actually the ones I go to get my information to take back to everybody else. Honestly, I come to these types of research to be able to talk to oil and gas and to be able to talk to mining and utility companies about what are known countermeasure strategies. I know that this type of research is done here at Johnson Space Center as well. And I know that some of the centers that have aviation already have in place fatigue risk management systems to be able to acknowledge and recognize the risk of fatigue in terms of its impact on flight errors. And when it comes to some of the projects that have those higher requirements in terms of time, so those that have the shift work, those that have the extended hours, my understanding from talking to people throughout the organization is that many of the current strategies in place, at least in terms of scheduling, are in keeping with nuclear and some of the other high reliability industries, those that have the higher fatigue risks. Organizationally, from the conversations I've had, I didn't see high levels of risk in terms of how it was managed. But we can look at the next level, that inner level that has to occur, because we recognize fatigue is not just caused by workplace hours that are requested, and that is that employee engagement. If we look at countermeasures that are used in the workplace, and this is a nice sort of long laundry list that was taken from some aviation maintenance research, we can see that we can think about those countermeasures in terms of the key objectives that they meet. So if you look across the top, you can see that these countermeasures were measured in terms of their ability to reduce fatigue, their ability to reduce or capture the fatigue-related errors, and finally, their ability to minimize the harm caused in relation to those errors. And what you notice is the training and education for supervisors and planning staff is really the only countermeasure that meets all three. And that training and education component is really important, giving people this type of information to understand when they're doing things like scheduling particular tasks at particular hours, when they're looking at overall countermeasures, as well as when people are looking at measuring and improving fatigue in their own regular daily lives. We can take some information that came from the AIMS countermeasure program and note that one of the most direct methods to translate the scientific findings from research and, to operational use is through that education and training. Education provides the critical foundation for all activities that address fatigue, and this one in particular was looking at aviation. Which brings us to the culture of excellence. The fact that by nature, this is an organization that attracts people who work at a high level of achievement. And I want to ask you, any type A's in the room? How many of you work with this guy? How many of you are this guy, right? And we can recognize there's a little bit of James in all of us, right? A little bit of Bond. We know we have that desire to sort of push through and make it happen. We are very achievement driven, and that's okay. But it's recognizing that even Bond needs to take a break once in a while. And we can look at it in terms of this. So this is a human function curve. And what this does is it basically relates our overall productivity and performance in terms of stress. Now, stress is not just that negative stress, it's also positive stress in terms of challenge and in terms of our engagement with our work. We don't want that low level of stress in our work. We don't want nothing to do. That sits us at that very bored, unmotivated bottom of the scale in terms of performance and productivity. It's not what we're aiming for. What we're aiming for is that optimal zone, that level right in the green, where we're challenged by the work that we do, we're seeking to be able to be successful in the work that we do, but it's sustainable. Now we know that if we've got the big deadline coming up and the pressure is on, we can push higher, so we can have that higher stress that will lead to higher levels of productivity, of performance, but only for the short term. When we try and keep that up, when we try and maintain that go, we end up in the red where our productivity and our performance drops off sharply. It's not sustainable. And that's where we hit the levels of fatigue and some of those mental and physical impacts that we were talking about earlier in relation to health. And when we think about managing fatigue at the engagement level, we also need to think about the cultural touch points. So I know that there's a lot of people who work here who could leave tomorrow and go out into industry and probably make more money. but there are a lot of reasons that people stay with NASA. So thinking about those reasons, thinking about the way that people in the organization interact with the agency. What keeps them here? Well, some of it is that mission, program, project success, that desire to be a part of that success. Some of it is the sense of belonging, being a part of NASA, and that sense of pride that you get from being part of the agency, from working at your center, from the team or the group that you're working with. Part of it is that drive to succeed, and part of it is even career goals and team achievements, personal and team achievements. And we can think about what drives people in terms of working with the agency, and now switch that in terms of how we can message out the cultural impacts of fatigue. So, for example, in terms of mission, program, project success, in order for us to truly be successful as a mission, we need to do it in a way that's sustainable. And we know that if we push ourselves to the level of impairment, it can have an impact on that. In terms of the sense of belonging, making sure that that overall message of balance, of being able to manage fatigue, is part of the overall message. So I know a lot of centers, for example, have things like yoga, meditation, mindfulness that occurs within the center. Now you're translating that message of belonging into one that encourages sustainability. When we think of the sense of pride, again, the recognition that here at NASA, human capital is valued. We value the people that work for the organization, and we want to ensure their health and wellness. And I know that that's already a key part of what you do. And when all of those are managed, when the organizational pieces are managed, when the workforce engagement, when people are given the information and the ability to feel that they can manage fatigue, then we've achieved that true safety culture. And part of it is looking at the core values and recognizing that those core values include health and wellness and managing fatigue, the balance of excellence, integrity, teamwork, and safety, how all of those are part of mission success. Part of it comes down to asking the questions. So I'm going to pose some questions right now, and then we're going to circle back to them at the end in terms of conversations. So, does NASA support balance or overachieving? What type of behavior is actually rewarded? Those that push or those that do it in a sustainable way? What are the real expectations? What is your center doing in terms of fostering the balance and managing of fatigue? And what are the easy win strategies that can be shared? What are some of those leading practices that are already occurring that can be shared across centers? And again, bringing it back to that all-encompassing view in terms of how to manage fatigue. Okay, we're moving into the final trait, and that is engagement. And when we think about engagement in terms of the other factors, we recognize that it is that all-encompassing one. It is that one that pulls it all together. When we think about engagement within the factors, we can think about giving people the resources to understand personal countermeasures in relation to fatigue. So giving them this type of information. We'll start off with how important sleep is in terms of managing fatigue. So, true or false? The only way to cure fatigue is through sleep. Being a little tricky in this one, I'll let you know. In this case, true, because we're talking about curing fatigue. Everything else that we do in terms of managing it is really just the Band-Aid solution that gets us through until we're able to get back to restore ourselves through sleep. Sleep debt. This is where most of us sit. The large majority of us are not staying up all night and pushing through the all-nighters. What we're doing is we're leading busy lives, and we've got lots to do in terms of work, and we've got lots to do in terms of personal commitments and social obligations, and we don't get enough sleep on Monday. And then again on Tuesday, we're pushing and things are going, and Wednesday and Thursday, until by Friday, we're sitting at that 8-hour sleep debt. which can lead us to the same level of impairment as having missed that whole night's sleep. Only it's become the way we always are. We're used to it. We aren't even necessarily seeing the difference. So if you can't get that sleep on a regular basis, and we know we've got the sleep debt that we need to make up from, there's the next best strategy. Who does it? Who here naps on a regular basis? It works. Oh, not too many, just, oh, wow, not many in the room at all. All right, so for everybody else, it comes down to two questions. Number one, do you need to nap? And number two, how can you do it successfully? So in terms of do you need to nap, if you did not answer yes to any of those sleep debt questions and you were putting up your hand at 7+ hours sleep, nope, you don't need to nap. You've got it managed. But if you were saying no to some of those, or yes to some of those sleep debt questions, and you were not putting up your hand at 7 hours, then this is definitely a strategy to be looking at, because you want to try and manage that sleep debt as you go. Again, when I talk to everybody else about sleep, I talk about you guys. This stuff was done way back in the 1990s. And there was some research where they looked at pilots who took in-flight naps. Way back. Pilots who took in-flight naps and those who didn't. And they came up with the 26-minute NASA nap. Iconic. Modern research is putting it closer to 15-20 as the optimal, but the 26-minute nap is still very valid. They found that pilots who took the NASA nap had a 34% increase in terms of performance. They had a 54% increase in terms of their alertness, as well as being able to demonstrate improved decision-making capabilities. But there's a secret to it. There is a secret to being a good napper, aside from finding that out-of-the-way place where you can do it. And the secret is timing is everything. When it comes to napping, you want your nap to be under 30 minutes. So 15 to 20 is sort of where it's targeting. 26 is still in the good. Why? Well, that under 30-minute nap keeps you in stage 1 and 2 sleep. You're going to wake up, you're going to be alert, you're not going to have any of that sleep inertia going on, and you're going to be restored in terms of alertness and mental capabilities. If you have a big sleep debt, if you are really sleep deprived, then you want to go for the 90 to 120-minute nap. Same thing. Now, though, instead of stage 1 and 2, you're going all the way through the sleep cycle and ending up back at stage 1 and 2. And again, you'll be fully restored and easy to wake up. What you don't want to do is set your alarm clock or have someone come wake you up at around the 45 to 60-minute range, because chances are very good you're going to end up in that deep stage 3 sleep. Best time to nap, circadian lows. That 1 to 3 in the afternoon is an optimal time to take a nap. If you're doing night shifts, pretty much any time works, but 2 to 5 is considered the best. Sleep resets your sleep meter, so to speak. So if you think about it mathematically, we are roughly 1 hour of sleep for every 2 hours of wakefulness, right? We have about 8 hours of sleep for approximately 16 hours of working during the day. And if you're feeling fatigued, that short nap can help sustain you when you're starting to dip, when you're starting to feel tired. It can bring you back on track and sustain you longer in terms of being awake. And if you're saying yes to the sleep debt questions, and particularly if you're working shift work, and we had that question earlier, anyone who's working the nights, almost by definition, should have a napping strategy to be able to manage that sleep debt. Sometimes in work environments where sleeping on the job is an absolute no-go, we can just talk about pre-shift naps, because that pre-shift nap can help sustain you through the night. Coffee, does it work? Yeah, absolutely. For mild to moderate levels of fatigue, coffee works really well. And coffee works because it really mimics the adenosine, which is a neurochemical that has us feeling sleepy and tired, and it sort of jumps in and takes the place in terms of the receptors for adenosine. And instead, it tends to wake us up, have us be alert, get a little bit of that adrenaline response going. Coffee takes about 20 minutes to kick into our system, and its half-life is around 5 hours, so after about 5 hours, most of the effects have worn off. It hits its prime effect about an hour after we start consuming it. Other strategies we can use aside from the caffeine, food. So we can be very purposeful about the way that we use food to help manage some of the symptoms in relation to fatigue. So what you're seeing is a measure of glycemic index. So food's glycemic index is really how it impacts our blood sugar levels. Foods with high glycemic index shoot our blood sugar levels up fairly quickly, but they also drop them fairly quickly, and we often feel hungry in those lulls. Food with low glycemic index brings our blood sugar levels up fairly slowly, keeps them fairly even, and then drops them slowly. When we're fighting those blood sugar levels that are going up and down when we are tired, and especially when we're sleeping outside of regular daytime hours, we want to choose the foods that have the low glycemic index. Try to even those blood sugar levels out. Now, the good news is that foods with low glycemic index are our healthier food choices anyways. There are whole fruits and vegetables and some of our dairy products and nuts. The bad news is that when you're really tired or when you're working shifts, chances are good you're going to want the donut, or in the case of today on the table, the candy bar. So when I talk to shift workers in particular, but when I talk to anyone who's using food to try and manage those blood sugar levels in relation to fatigue, try to resist the donut. If you absolutely can't, then at least try and pair it up with the low glycemic index food so that you're not doing that yo-yo up and down, you're managing to maintain those even blood sugars. And the one to avoid. Yeah, I know, it does look pretty good. No? Believe it or not, this is a big one for me. I travel extensively for the work that I do. And when I'm traveling, guess what kind of food is most easily available? This kind of food. The problem is when you eat that big, heavy, fatty meal, a lot of your body's digestive energy goes towards digesting that big, heavy meal, and it'll leave you very tired. Think sort of post-Thanksgiving, right? How does everybody feel? Really tired. And this kind of heavy food when you're driving can be a real risk factor. We can also use light very purposefully. So we can recognize that that blue light, those circadian rhythms, right? A lot of our devices have some of that blue light spectrum in them. So things like our computers, our phones, our TVs have blue light. It's not an issue if you're someone who can watch TV right before bed, go to sleep, not have a problem. But if you're suffering from insomnia or you're having trouble getting to sleep at night, recognizing that that blue light is really telling your brain it's time to wake up, it's time to be alert, and then you shut the TV off or the computer off and try and go to sleep. App manufacturers have long since recognized this issue, and there's apps that you can get for your computer that will change the light spectrum at a certain time. So I actually have mine set for 10 o'clock at night. And from 10 o'clock at night on, if I'm using my computer, I don't have blue light spectrum involved. Phones have settings. There's a setting on just about every major phone I've managed to look at that will put it into the nighttime settings. Same thing, you lose the blue light spectrum. But being aware. Also, if you're having trouble going to sleep at night, get lots of light exposure in the morning. Getting that hard reset and telling your brain when it's time to wake and when it's time to sleep. So what do we do for the jet lag? What do we do when we have to travel and we're moving across those time zones? Well, there are some strategies that we can use, and again, they involve recognizing light. So some of the strategies, adjust ahead if you can, so try and get yourself in the new rhythm if possible. As soon as you get to the new time zone, move to the new time zone. So adjust when you eat and adjust your social interactions and adjust everything you're doing to the new time zone. Try to avoid things like alcohol and caffeine. They sort of mess up your body's ability to shift really well. And get some sun. If you're moving east, you want to get your sun early in the morning because you're going to be trying to go to bed early and you're going to be trying to get up early, and that's hard for us to be able to shift in that direction. But if you're heading west, try and get your extra sun a little bit later in the afternoon because you're going to be trying to stay up a lot later, and then you're going to be trying to sleep in a little bit later. So using those light cues to help you shift to your new environment. And for those of us that have the winter issues, there's also a strategy to be able to deal with that seasonal affective disorder. It starts with buying these light boxes. Now, these light boxes, you can get them in different places. I've seen them in drugstores and whatnot. But they're a special light box that has a 10,000 lux light, and it has a lot of the blue light spectrum. You want to use this light for about an hour when you first wake up. You want to use it only for about half an hour, and you want to not have it right directly looking in your eyes. You want to have it off to the peripheral. And in essence, what this light box will do is it will help a lot of people be able to stop that circadian drift and reset their circadians to that early morning start. I use this light personally. I had trouble with seasonal affective disorder in that it was causing massive insomnia. So starting about November and working through till around end of January, I would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, wide awake, for 3 months straight. I was a walking zombie. And I did that for about 2 years straight. Discovered the light box, used it for about 3 days, never had an issue again. So it can work very effectively for a lot of people. At the end of the day, the time when fatigue is going to impact safety for the large majority of us is when we're driving. So if we think about when we're driving, whether it's commuting to and from or driving with work, use the hierarchy of controls. If possible, you want to try and eliminate it. Eliminate fatigue before you go on the long drive. If you're feeling tired, pull over, take the nap. If you can't, at least try and reduce it. So take those breaks, don't drive for too long in a stretch, get out, walk around the vehicle. If you're at that stage where you are just temporarily holding off fatigue, so you're turning up the air and maybe you're turning up the music and shifting around, trying to keep yourself awake, it's really short term. And, you know, nobody wants to end up like that guy. So as I finish off, I want to share with you a couple of my favorite strategies for managing fatigue. One, I'm not going to recommend to anybody, but I'm going to share it anyways because it's just so great. So this strategy I actually learned when I was working at a really remote mining camp. And I had this old miner in the back of the room put up his hand and say, "I got the perfect strategy. Works for me every time. I never fall asleep when I'm driving." Oh, do tell, right? I'm always interested in new strategy. You got to picture this guy. He was 55, maybe 60 years old, and he had this massive comb over going on. And he proceeds to take the comb over, and he's gathering up all the hair. He says, "Yep, I just gather up my hair," and he demonstrates. He says, "Roll down the window, put the hair in, roll it back up, and I never fall asleep," he says. Not the strategy I'm recommending for most, probably wouldn't work for a lot. But the one strategy I will recommend, my favorite strategy, is what I call the Nappuccino. So the Nappuccino is really a 1-2 punch for moderate fatigue. What you do is you pull over and you get your favorite caffeine source, be it coffee, pop, tea, whatever it is. You down it fairly quickly. You want to try and ingest that caffeine in a relatively short period of time. Then you settle in for your nap, set your alarm for 10-15 minutes, and when you wake up, you got the 1-2 punch. You've got the restored from your sleep, you got the caffeine kicking in. It's a really great strategy when you're trying to manage fatigue. All right, that's it for our personal countermeasures. And really, what I want to take a look at now is where do we go from here? So taking a look at a lot of the understandings that we shared, taking a look at some of the questions that we asked when we were looking at those cultural touch points, and trying to share forward what exists at your center in terms of fatigue risks, what exists in terms of barriers, what exists in terms of leading practices that you're doing that you could share with other centers, and moving the conversations from there. Thanks.
All right, so very interesting, and I like your idea of naps, but we're not going to do any today, okay, guys? So the first question, what are the barriers that need to be overcome to further advance fatigue management at your center?
No, that's asking out. Yeah. Yeah, so do you want, yeah, so we could take a look at that one? Or do we want to do all four?
Oh, do we want to do all four? So and the other one would be like, what strategies have you gained today that you can bring back to your center to enhance management fatigue? And then what are the leading practices being used to advance the management of fatigue? And then what easy win strategies can be used across the agency to improve the process of fatigue management? Let's see. One of the things I thought about was fatigue and being in charge of the MISHAP program for the agency. I've seen this come across several times in some of our mishaps, like you alluded to early on in the beginning of fatigue. So there are some good things there. But some of the questions asked midway through the thing is, does NASA support balance or overachieving?
And that's probably a really good place to start. So in terms of looking at the barriers, and a lot of the understandings that I brought were from conversations I had with several people within the organization, within the safety groups. So I think that's really a good place to start. What are some of the barriers that, or sorry, some of the issues that you're identifying in terms of managing fatigue within your center? Yeah.
So we recently at our center went through this detanking mode for one of our tanks that needs repair, and so it was a 24 operation for about it's actually winding down now at about 2 weeks. So we kind of use the human factors method that we have in place to kind of make sure the supervisors were talking to the employees to understand what was going on there from a personal standpoint. Because we did actually have a close call that came in because an employee said, you know, no one asked me to work later and that kind of thing. And so we had to kind of take a step back. So we're trying to do some outreach on that and coupling it with our work, maximum work policy. So so that's kind of what we're doing. But I think this, of course, delves a little deeper that we probably need to do a little more. But right now we're trying to work with the supervisors to kind of talk to the employees and understand, especially with us working 12-hour shifts around the clock like that. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, I would say you're using some of both levels, right? You're using some of those organizational pieces in terms of your maximum hours of work policy, in terms of trying to schedule it as best you can. But you're also trying to do that engagement piece, having supervisors check in with people, you know, where are you at today? How are you feeling? Yeah, that's important. And I think what I would add to that is a little bit more of the education piece, right? Talking about, you know, if you are tired, what does it mean in terms of impairment, and what are some strategies you can use? Yeah.
Dr. Sawatsky, for investigators gathering evidence after an incident, how many hours back would you recommend they go to establish the waking and sleeping history of operators or decision makers? Are we talking 24, 48, 72 hours, or what?
Minimum 48. So you want to look a minimum 48 hours when you're looking back, and you want to make sure that you're asking the questions that not just determine total hours of sleep, but also those that determine quality of sleep. And so talking, really actually asking the questions that'll talk through events that happened in the night. For example, one incident investigation I was looking through, there was a thunderstorm the previous night. It was an aviation one, and there was a thunderstorm the previous night. And so, at first the pilot was asked, how'd you sleep? Oh, good. What about the thunderstorm? Oh, yeah, like I woke up a lot with the thunderstorm. So really sort of asking those questions to determine, because sometimes it's not top of mind what people are thinking of. But 48 hours is typically what's looked at. But if there's issues in that, then you might look even more than 72. You might look back for sort of long-term sleep pattern issues. Yeah.
Okay, and then, when it asks the question, does NASA support balance or overachieving? I'm going to say right now it supports overachieving. And you see it a lot, especially up at my level, where you see the push to make schedule, the push to be on time for everything, because of the fact if you're not, Congress kind of questions you, what are you doing with their money, because you're not getting to the level you need to get to. So you kind of see it as an overachieving, but yet it's an overachieving in where we try to balance it and do it, adequately so that we don't get into that realm of having the mishaps due to fatigue and everything else. But you also have to get to a point that you're still meeting the obligation and the expectation that the people want to see of you. So.
Yeah. And you're in that difficult place where some of the pressures in terms of overachieving are external and beyond control, right? In terms of the budgets that are set, in terms of the timelines that are set, there's not always that ability to be fully flexible. And so that is where some of those best practices, some of those strategies, some of that shared knowledge in the room, I think, is really essential in terms of finding sometimes outside of the box solutions to be able to manage those external pressures and difficult timelines, in terms of also trying to create that sustainability and have people be able to manage their fatigue. And I think that's also where that cultural piece comes in. So yes, we know we've got the deadline. Yes, we have to achieve it. But is there that thought that we should all be working 24/7 and working to the level of exhaustion? I always find it really fascinating. We would never think of taking a piece of technology or a piece of equipment and running it beyond manufacturer specs and not doing maintenance and not refueling. We would totally expect that equipment to break down. And yet when it comes to people, we do that all the time, and then we're surprised when people are becoming ill and not capable of doing what they need to be doing.
I think one of the biggest points that we get to is during launch day, as you alluded to on some early on, is usually if you did a scrub, you end up maybe getting 5 hours off the clock before you had to be back on the console again. So it seemed like that was one of those deals where you talk about what type of behavior is actually rewarded. That would be one of those that would be actually rewarded, having you back there on the console and ready to go ahead and proceed with a countdown that, normally that you're tired. And if you have more than one scrub, we've had them where we've gone up to 3 scrubs. So it made a lot of people very exhausted, and then you'd have to push out for at least 24 hours to 48 hours.
And it's not unusual to have those operational demands that require you to push into fatigue. Absolutely, those are situations where you've got people who, due to the nature of the job requirement, have to work those longer hours and have to push into fatigue. And that, to me, is when you're working those higher risks, that's where you need to have other things in place, maybe more double check procedures. When you know that you've got people working who are really tired, when you know some of those critical decision makers have not had the adequate sleep that they need, trying to introduce some redundancies so that you've got a little bit more double check than you normally would. And then the other piece is education. Let people know some of the strategies that can be used to try and push past that fatigue to be able to get the job done when the job needs done.
Hi, this is Chris. Back in my OSHA days, a bunch of residents came to OSHA and said, anybody knows that they're a resident doctor in their training, that they would often have to work 3 or 4 days straight, and they would have a little nap room, but they often didn't get a chance to do it. So they approached OSHA and said, we're really worried about patient safety. And of course, OSHA punted on that because they didn't know how to regulate it. But this is obviously a very, like you said, if you operate, would you let a doctor drunk operate on you?
Good point. And when I work with the medical profession, I sort of shake my head at the irony of people who are intimately aware of physical health and wellness and yet are sort of in the position of self-sacrificing due to the requirements. And resident doctors are the worst. I know we have resident doctors who work 36-hour shifts and get 12 hours off in total, which is your get home, get back, before they're back on for another 36-hour shift. And absolutely, is that
so the question is that, DOT has rules about operating vehicles. What kind of policies and regulations could we consider that one are enforceable and would actually make a difference, do you guys think? Because that's really the issue. OSHA threw up their hands and said, I don't know how to do this, and it's not worth the fight because it's going to take 12 years, 15 years to even promulgate a rule. But the reality is that we can do something about it if we really want to.
And that's a question where I could give some background and information on, but I think at the end it comes down to the collective information in the room that would make that type of decision. But I can bring it back to the legislative piece that I drafted a few years ago. And sadly enough, it didn't make it through our system either. It didn't even get up to industry feedback stage. It died before it got that far. Scheduling hours and having set hours of work and restrictions on those hours of work, that's a good first step. I mean, we need to look more comprehensively at the whole issue, but it's a really good first step in terms of managing fatigue. But there are times where that doesn't work, when you've got certain missions that require those extended hours, if you've got the scrub launch and have to come back, or even in a lot of industries. A lot of industries will receive exemptions from what are typical maximum hours of work. And so other strategies that you can use are having more of the comprehensive fatigue risk management systems and strategies in place. So that's where you can think of multiple levels. You can have proactive and reactive controls in place. Things like what was being done, is it Goddard? Are you at Goddard? No? So, okay. In terms of checking with employees and making sure that they're okay. Strategies where you have the ability to self-declare, and you've got mechanisms in place that are non-punitive in terms of allowing someone to self-declare when fatigue is an issue. And there's a whole variety of strategies that go into a comprehensive fatigue risk management strategy, and that is one that you can use to try and help regulate. But at the end of the day, if you're asking someone to work 36 hours straight, there isn't going to be that perfect fail-safe. You're going to be pushing that person to the level of impairment, and you've got to recognize that that's going to happen. Yeah.
So somebody had a question here. Sleep apnea affects a lot of NASA employees. Do you have any strategies around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't get into sleep disorders simply due to time constrictions. But sleep apnea is a really significant sleep disorder, and it's one that people actually aren't aware of. So if you were answering yes to question number 5, but you were also telling me that you're getting around 7 or 8 hours sleep, definitely check out the possibility that sleep apnea is an issue. So sleep apnea is in essence a sleep disorder that causes the tongue to relax too much, and it blocks the air passage while people are sleeping. You know someone with sleep apnea because typically they snore. Typically they have a larger neck circumference, which is another really common sign. And what you'll do if you ever listen to them is they do the snore, 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 snore. And then the big gasp as they start breathing again. So they're actually stopping breathing, and then sort of their instinctive breath reflex will kick in and cause them to wake up and gasp. And they'll do that hundreds of times blood oxygen level dropping. It is a really significant one. In terms of strategies, there are some preventative strategies and some strategies that will help to some level. Because neck circumference is an issue, losing weight can help. There's been some strategies in terms of people sleeping on their sides, but almost exclusively the best way to manage sleep apnea is to get tested and check that you have sleep apnea, and then use the positive airway pressure or PAP device, which is a device that people use when they're sleeping, and it has forced air that helps you sleep through the night. I talk to a lot of people with obstructive sleep apnea in the work that I do, especially if I give like a general health and wellness at a conference. I get lots of people with sleep issues who come and attend, and I hear two stories. I hear it saved me. I did not know what a walking zombie I was until I was able to use that, and I hear I couldn't get used to it, I couldn't manage it, and I don't use it, and I still have all my issues. So if you can push past the device, that is the way to do it. But absolutely, when it comes to obstructive sleep apnea, I suggest get tested, get the device, have it managed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yep.
Do you have any advice for managers that have a select number of people and have to run a 24/7 operation? So I think doctors, nurses, police, but we have test operations that run like that. You'll have a test campaign that'll go, say, 3 months, and you have a small group of people. Where can a manager go to look so that he doesn't kill his people working those third shift?
So again, you're sort of that rock and hard place where you've got set requirements in terms of you've only got so many people and they've got to run those 24-hour shifts. You're running people into the higher levels of risk in terms of fatigue. So you want to, as much as you can, accommodate the work environment to help them manage that. I don't know the thoughts on it, but sleeping on shift is a really good strategy to help people try and find that balance. Also accommodating them in any way that you can in terms of managing their sleep. So having good quality food on site, especially for the night shift, because it's not like they can have a lot available. Having the caffeine, and then again the education piece. So talking to people about being aware of the risks that they're taking, letting them know they're going to be less capable at night, but using those strategies. So it's a tough situation, and just know that you're exposing them to higher risks, and so managing those in a variety of strategies. Yeah.
I have sort of an answer to that Johnson Space Center, I recently learned more about in our flight ops directorate, the mission control regimen they go through. And as you can imagine, space stations up there 24/7, 365, going on 20 years. There's actually a very, and this is the issue, is having enough bodies, basically. Having enough bodies to cover those shifts. They've got quite a regimen of flight controllers. And the interesting thing that I learned is they've got compulsory limits on their times, and they let their employees select the grouping of hours that they want to do, which I thought was also very interesting. Is some people actually prefer working through the night, some people actually prefer working through weekends, and then having 1 or 2 days during the week off. So if you have enough people to distribute that time to, that seems to work well with a long test regimen, and at White Sands we'd go through that as well. That gets harder because obviously you're not going to have as many skilled people to cover that time. But occasionally, if you work ahead and it's a long period of a long test regimen, you can get some better qualified Kelly people, temporary folks, whether it be retired folks or whatever, to come in and help add those hours to the regimen, and we've done that before as well. So it really comes down to having enough people, and if you put the investment in qualifying those people up front so that they know what they're doing, that works really well. The problem is, though, you still have the type A's that are managing and directing that activity. Yes. Yeah. So while they may have people on console that have limitations, and of course those are the folks hitting the button that are going to be in the most critical points, unfortunately, there's still management up there that's a type A that's going to want to just shepherd that whole thing through. And that's just something that takes leadership to overcome.
It's also harder to change out the manager, right? You can't get the Kelly services to come in and do that job. Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's really important, that sharing of best practices. You know, I can provide you with high-level understandings in terms of managing fatigue and other experiences in other industries, but I think knowledge about what's being done at other centers and sharing that forward is a really critical part of the equation. Yeah.
So one of the things that, going with what David was saying and everything else about the shift work that we do on the consoles and everything else on our mission control, it is good, but there's also another layer where we have a situation right now where we have a lot of individuals that are dual-hatted. In other words, they have more than one job that they're working at a time, you know, and nobody behind them. So they're like a single point failure, if you want to say. So we do carry a risk for that particular issue, but the risk does not take into account fatigue as it should. So I think what you have brought up here is gives me a little bit more insight to maybe go look at some of our risk that we have on the institutional side and make sure that fatigue was taken into account when we looked at those risks too.
Yeah, when it comes to particular projects, even having a project matrix where you can identify the level of fatigue risk within the project and then think about what controls should come into that particular project. So when you're running your really high risks in terms of scheduling and looking at those tasks. So if you remember, those visual perceptions are highly impacted by fatigue. It's a task that is very susceptible to fatigue degradation in terms of skill. So when you look at things like air traffic controllers, fatigue is a huge issue in their ability to properly perform their duty. And so in terms of your console operators, how much is that task going to be impacted by fatigue? So I think having some sort of a matrix where you are able to identify not just the scheduling, but the tasks and other factors, even looking at your demographic, recognizing when you're going to be incurring your higher risk levels in terms of fatigue, and then having set mitigation strategies for those. So whether your scheduling piece involves maybe recognizing that in this case we need to outsource some of our people and bring in extra people, that's a fantastic strategy to try and find that balance, because you know you're pushing people to the extreme. And I don't know how it works in terms of overtime and extra pay, but often you can even build the business case where you can demonstrate that the additional costs we're going to incur in terms of health insurance, in terms of absenteeism, in terms of people needing time off, or extended time off, those can be balanced by some of our proactive causes of bringing some people in, or proactive solutions, pardon me, bringing people in, and you can build the business case where financially it makes sense to manage it in the forefront instead of after the fact.
Yeah, and I know that we have for like our space operations, you know, our astronauts are on a time deal where they have to take, you know, they get certain time off that they have to sleep, and then they get a day off after a certain amount of days of doing certain tasks while on orbit and everything else. And our mission support groups do the same thing. But however, you know, even our flight crews for aircraft and everything else, you know, they have an 8-hour type that they got to be have 8 hours of rest before they can fly and everything else. But I think sometimes we miss the point of the ground crews and everything else that stay with the aircraft or stay down there doing maintenance while you're scrub turnaround or whatever, that we just don't take into account that could be a major issue if they don't get the right amount of sleep. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, impairment in terms of fixing a critical piece on the aircraft is as important as pilot error. And especially there's a lot of tasks that fall into those high risk factor for fatigue, like things like fuselage inspection. I mean, that's a really boring, monotonous task that you've got to be really, you know, constantly paying attention to. So yeah, for sure. We often manage it better in those industries where one incident will impact the entire industry consistently, right? We know that if a pilot crashes, that impacts everyone's thought in terms of, you know, jumping on an airplane. It'll have the whole industry. And we tend to manage it less when it's more individual or localized in terms of impact. But that doesn't mean that's right. Yeah.
Okay, Susan.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, I'd just like to finish by really encouraging you as over the next 3 days, have the conversations, share some of those best practices, and share some of those easy wins that some centers are doing in terms of managing it. And you know, I think that knowledge in the room is a really critical part of all this. Yeah, thanks.
Yep. So we like to, you know, to help her sleep tonight, we have a little token of our appreciation. It's we like to give out books that NASA does up and everything else, so that you got something to read by. But like I said, might put you to sleep too. So
Awesome. All right.
thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry.